Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. Season of Discovery is out. Currently the level cap is 50, and soon players will be getting into the endgame content, and some believe it'll go down the full Classic Plus route with new raids and zones, levels and whatnot, especially with the release of the official timeline where, at the end for Season of Discovery, the developers tease endgame content updates, which could mean anything really, but whatever it may be, many at least want it to be within the spirit of vanilla. So whatever that means also varies from person to person, but what could be more close than what the original developers planned back before its release? So that's going to be the focus of today. Though World of Warcraft is quite a large game, it was intended to be much larger. There are quite a lot of zones, instances, and features that were planned at one point, but they were scrapped due to one reason or another, usually due to a lack of time. So in this video, we're going to show them to see what could potentially be in store for those checking out the Season of Discovery, if Classic Plus is indeed the route that they go down. So some of these you may know of, some maybe not. Let's just start with the big one, and that's the Ashbringer questline. One of the earliest fables within the game was that in Vanilla WoW, players could obtain the iconic Ashbringer, which was once held by the leader of the Silver Hand, Alexandros Mograine, and it makes sense. From the Four Horsemen fight in Exramus, players can obtain the corrupted Ashbringer, and there exists some extra lore in the Scarlet Monastery dungeon. If you take it to the Cathedral Wing, the mobs become friendly, and you get a unique cutscene with some RP between Alexandros and his son, and even some dialogue with High Inquisitor Fairbanks, alluding that the weapon could be cleansed if you brought it to Mograine's lost son in the Outland, which only mystified players back then because, well, the Outland obviously didn't exist. Regardless, it started a mad scramble of players trying to unlock the secrets to cleansing the corruption. Many fake screenshots started to crop up, and players got so desperate that it would infamously lead to fishing outside of Strathholm because it was jokingly referenced in a flavor item that you looted in the Altric Valley battleground. This itself would later be referenced by Blizzard actually for unlocking an alternate appearance for the Legion artifact version of the weapon. But combining all of this with the fact that the weapon does actually exist within the game files, it's not surprising that it became one of the game's most popular myths. But for one reason or another, probably because casters hadn't gotten a legendary yet, they instead went with the Atius chain, and Ashbringer was kinda thrown to the wayside. As time would show, players would finally be able to obtain it during the Legion expansion through the artifact system, but this definitely has potential to see attention within the Season of Discovery. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is certainly opinionated. I think that there's definitely weight to the argument that by giving players such an iconic weapon, it's no longer iconic, and we saw that with Legion, with an Ashbringer around every corner. But maybe making the chain extremely expensive and time-consuming and difficult to finish could potentially be a way to circumvent that. Maybe they can make it a time-limited system like the Scarab Lord, so only a very few lucky players per server would be the recipients. Next, we have a zone that you probably know about. That's Mount Hyjal. Nestled in northern Kalimdor, there's quite a large zone, but when you mouse over it, you'll find that it doesn't have a name, and the closest that players were able to get to it was on a flight path. But with some tricky wall jumping and some persistence, you'd find a zone that seems fully crafted geographically, but just lacking mobs and NPCs. The one exception being the infamous Guardians of Blizzard, which were these infernals that they haphazardly threw about the area that would insta-kill any trespassers to sort of guard the area. It was a very poor band-aid fix, because players could quite easily sneak past them and explore this never-before-seen zone. Some highlights would be the crater where Archimonde landed in Warcraft 3. Intriguingly, you also have a clone of the Onyxia raid entrance, clearly showing that there were some plans for another raid in Vanilla. And finally, of course, the bones of Archimonde hanging off the World Tree, laying in the same spot where he was vanquished in the RTS. This zone would be unfinished for all of Vanilla, and would first be repurposed in the Battle of Hyjal raid in the Burning Crusade, and later, of course, in Cataclysm, where it was properly finished with quests, mobs, and NPCs, and players are now enjoying that in Cataclysm Classic, actually. As far as potential content for Classic Plus is concerned though, this one definitely has a lot of it, and it's usually one of the first zones that people think of for new content in vanilla. After Hyjal, I of course have to follow up with Karazhan. Most know this as the introductory level 70 raid for the Burning Crusade, and then also the remake in Legion, but Karazhan was supposed to be in the vanilla version of the game, and it was ultimately scrapped due to time constraints, and as John Statz described in his book, The World of Warcraft Diary, there were also challenges with level design. The portal lies dormant in vanilla World of Warcraft, as there's no dungeon ID associated with it, and the closest that players ever got was through the creation of Atiesh in Naxxramas, after collecting its shards from the various bosses and defeating Kel'Thuzad. Aside from its high-end stats, upon use, it created a portal straight to Karazhan for its wielder and their raid to use, so clearly there were plans for it to be implemented in some way in vanilla. Although the instance itself didn't exist, that didn't stop players from exploring its outskirts. Off to the side is what is known as the Karazhan Crypts, which is completely devoid of mobs and NPCs, but nonetheless is quite extensive, containing many catacombs and corridors, and an underwater room called the Pool of Upside Down Sinners. Obviously there were big plans here. Some speculate a dungeon, others even another raid, some just a questing area. Blizzard did eventually make partial use out of this area in the Legion expansion, but whether it be the crypts or even the raid itself, it's certainly one of the big unfinished areas just asking to be finished for Season of Discovery. Azshara is a zone infamous for neglect. Aside from a handful of quests, a molten core reputation that sends you into the middle of nowhere once a week for a douse, and also a world boss, there's really not a lot going on here. In fact, back in the day, because of this and its resulting low traffic, it was one of the more popular bot farms because they would have less of a chance of being found and reported by the players. However, adventurous players with a keen eye would uncover the remnants of the Azshara Crater Battleground. But before we get into that, I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a learning platform that teaches you backend web development in Python, SQL, and Go. I've been sponsored by them for quite a while now, and I've gotten some pretty good feedback because it's resonated quite a lot with you guys, because they've made it into this RPG-like experience where you can earn XP, achievements, and rewards as you complete lessons. It offers you actual projects to build, like something that you would do at a job, so it gives you real-world experience. And they also have an active Discord community, as well as Boots, the AI-powered tutor to help guide you through any concepts that you might have trouble with. And if you want to take a break from the lessons, they also recently launched the Training Grounds, which offers infinite challenges, so there's a lot of variety in how you learn. And if you're unsure, they also offer a 30-day no questions asked refund policy, so give it a shot today at boot.dev and use my code MadSeasonShow to get 25% off your entire first year on the annual plan. But anyways, back to the video. Similar to the Warsong entrance on the border between Ashenville and the Barrens, you'll find abandoned Horde and Alliance encampments, which would serve as the hub that held the faction NPCs and vendors, and also the portal to zone into the actual battleground. Not much is known of this battleground other than an abandoned map file, and that it was going to be MOBA in style. At this point, there was a mod for Warcraft 3 named Dota that was becoming extremely popular. As it turns out, popular enough that they would make a standalone version of the game called Dota 2, and eventually escape the grasp of Blizzard through a lengthy legal battle. And though Blizzard tried their hand at this game mode officially in 2015 with the release of Heroes of the Storm, their earliest attempt, if you would call it that, was the Azshara Crater, which would be a third-person MMO take on the genre, possibly similar to Smite for those who have played that game. That's not the only missing piece from the zone though. Back during the pre-release, the more adventurous players would, of all things, find the remnants of the Dark Portal buried in the waters off of the coast, which may seem strange at first, but back during the alpha of the game, they just used this Dark Portal as a placeholder for dungeon entrances. Funny enough though, back then, because this wasn't as widely known, this would turn Azshara into one of the many hotspots for exploration by players who thought that the Outland secretly existed. Maybe one of those people trying to figure out how to cleanse their Ashbringer. But regardless of all of that, at some point, There were plans for a dungeon in the waters of Ashara, but for unknown reasons, again, probably time constraints, it was abandoned. So certainly something they have an opportunity to revive in the Season of Discovery and actually give more purpose to a pretty barren zone. Speaking of instances, our next destination lies in Stormwind. In the western part of the city, players can find the Stormwind Stockade, which is a prison overrun by rebellious Defias gang members. Although it's quite simple, it's one of the more iconic and memorable dungeons from vanilla. Most people have run it at some point, but did you know that to the east, there's another stockade? It's blocked off by a gate, but if you're able to slip past it, you'll find a portal, and this one actually works. This is the Stockade Raid, as it's known. Think the dungeon, but just much bigger and much easier to get lost in since everything looks the same, pretty much. This version holds 2 floors of the rooms and hallways that you can find in the Stockade dungeon. It is completely empty of mobs, of course, but interesting to see that it was finished enough to actually exist. Now, some would say that this doesn't really have a lot of potential for Classic Plus because it's unfair to the Horde, and my response to that is, first off, fuck the Horde, but 2, I would actually make the argument that this is exactly what the spirit of vanilla is. Vanilla is quite known for not being hyper obsessed with balance and fairness. I mean, just look at the 2 exclusive classes. Maybe a good middle ground would be that if it is a raid or a dungeon, give the Horde an equivalent somewhere in Orgrimmar, but still keep them completely unique. Unique bosses, unique layout, quests, loot. I think that would be way more spirit of vanilla than anything else that they could do. And it also encourages replayability since both factions offer more unique experiences. But we're not leaving Stormwind yet. I of course have to mention this gate right here between the Trade District and Old Town. Kind of in a dead-end area, you'll find an instance portal that's gated off, which just left players wondering what plans they had for it. But as it turns out, what you're looking at is one of the earlier attempts at player housing. Not the first, as evidenced by the screenshot from the alpha, which perfectly encapsulates exactly why housing wouldn't work in World of Warcraft. Every area has a purpose, whether it be a questing hub, a spawn location for enemies. Giving players the ability to drop houses would be disruptive, assuming that they behave, which they of course won't, because the first thing they'll do is plop it down on top of critical hubs. For player housing to work, the world has to be built for it. A good example here would be Star Wars Galaxies, where the planets were absolutely massive, but also mostly empty to support player buildings, and not just houses, and not even neighborhoods, but entire cities with shuttle ports and respawn points and strip clubs. But because the world wasn't built for it in WoW, the only way for it to work really is for it to be instanced, and the developers realized this as early as vanilla, as you can see, as this portal would zone you into a housing district in Stormwind, where presumably you could purchase or rent your own residence, possibly decorate it, possibly invite party or guild members over, maybe a good RP spot for guild meetings or something. But as was shown in the Warlords of Draenor, this system also has its issues, such as the world becoming empty and feeling more like a single-player game, which is very anti-vanilla in my opinion. So as far as Classic Plus is concerned, I think that it would be a bad call, and I think because of that it probably won't be a thing, but I wanted to mention it anyway since I feel like it's too big to leave out, a remnant of one of the very first attempts at player housing in the game. No one can really agree on what Classic Plus is, but what I commonly see is a level cap increase, and with a level cap increase probably means new quests, new zones, and preferably, in my opinion, within the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor, since I think they're a pretty big part of Vanilla's identity. So in this case, real estate will be pretty important, so areas like Hyjal would be prime for this, but there are more. One of the big ones, second to Hyjal, can be found on the northern end of the Eastern Plaguelands. These 2 zones would eventually become Quolthalas, the Eversong Woods and Ghostlands in the Burning Crusade expansion. At the border here, you'll find some fallen trees blocking the path, with a high elf named Adon, of course referring that this area is indeed planned for an add-on or expansion, the Burning Crusade. So unlike Hyjal, this area doesn't actually exist physically in the game. Well, at least it's not crafted and fleshed out to the extent of Hyjal. If you get past the fallen trees, you will find a small little elven hut. Apparently, Quothalas wasn't as huge of an empire as we thought, but aside from that, it's just all unfinished flat plains. But looking at the map here, this is a ton of land for 2 or 3 entire zones that they could create in their own unique way. But next, we have the Emerald Dream. This is another really old myth from the game, and one that's been flirted with here and there in Legion and Dragonflight. But the earliest version exists in Vanilla World of Warcraft, though it never saw the light of day. It's referenced in-game in a few areas. A protagonist from the RTS series, Malfurion Stormrage, is residing in it through all of Vanilla, and the players are able to have a dialogue with him via the Scepter of the Shifting Sands questline from Ahn'Qiraj. As far as its purpose is concerned, it could really be anything. It could be another zone, it could be a raid, or a dungeon. It really depends on what they envision Classic Plus to be, again, if it's even going to exist at all. Questlines hold the potential for unfinished content, certainly, and there are quite a few to be found in Vanilla. One of the more mysterious ones, and loosely related to the Emerald Dream, is the Aranicus questline, where after killing the final boss of the Sunken Temple, players can loot the Essence of Aranicus trinket, which upon use produces a green AoE fart cloud, and also a rage whisper like how you get in PvP. This opens up a quest to an NPC named Atharius in the Swamp of Sorrows, who then sends you to another guy in Winterspring where it just abruptly ends, and taking your essence in the process, so you don't want to do this, especially considering how rare good trinkets are in Vanilla. A community manager back in 2005 teased that the questline was being worked on, and it had promise, but unfortunately, for unknown reasons, it never saw the light of day. Across over the sea, on Kalimdor, we have a similar situation with Uldum. First, though, paying a visit to the Uldaman dungeon. At the end, players can complete the Platinum Discs quest, which gives a lot of lore of the Titans that approximately 1% of the player base actually read because it's really, really long. But even more unknown, and there's nothing to tell you this, but this opens up another quest scouting out a giant locked gate with elite giants patrolling nearby. This is Uldum, another area that was planned for Vanilla WoW. Talking to the Stonewatcher through the quest, he'll tell you that he won't grant you access without an item called the Plates of Uldum, which could possibly have been a key for attunement, much like the Drakefire Amulet for Onyxia. And reporting back to Ironforge, the Explorers League will tell you to come back soon, and that Uldum beckons. Well, as it turned out, soon meant 2010, during the Cataclysm, where it was finally finished and turned into a full-fledged zone with quests and dungeons and a raid. Next to Hyjal, and what would eventually become Eversong and Ghostlands, this is definitely a contender for endgame content updates. And in the same zone, not too far away, we of course have the Caverns of Time, where the possibilities really are limitless. Obviously, the instance portals are inactive in Vanilla here, but this is when you really start to realize just how much content was originally intended for Vanilla. This area, as players would find out in the Burning Crusade, is a hub for crucial moments within the game's world that don't line up with the current timeline, whether that be the opening of the Dark Portal prior to the events of the game, or the culling of Stratholme, or the battle for Hyjal. It holds many memorable dungeons and raids. When time travel is involved, the options are limitless, really, so anything can go here. Maybe there'll even be a portal to stop BFA and Shadowlands from happening, or from the developers ruining the 2019 line of Classic by releasing gameplay destroying level boosts, and later the WoW token. Told you so, by the way. Anyways, next we have Grimbatal. Back on over to the Eastern Kingdoms, in the Wetlands will be a gauntlet of elite dragonkin, and at the end, a giant locked gate. The War of the Three Hammers, which were between the Bronzebeards, the Dark Irons, and the Wildhammer, had concluded, with the Bronzebeards as the victor, and while the Dark Irons got drunk and made their home in the Blackrock Mountain, the Wildhammer ventured north past the gates of Dun Gaz and founded their own kingdom in the mountain of Grimbatal, which they were later forced out of after it had been cursed during an attack by the Dark Iron. one of Thorison's sorcerers, Modgood, had cursed the cities for shadows to attack all who entered, and though she met her demise, her curse remained. Eventually, the fortress was seized by the Dragonmaw clan and used as a prison for Alexstrasza before she got breast reduction surgery. As players would find out, this would be another area that would finally be finished during the Cataclysm expansion, where the Twilight's Hammer eventually took up residence. But as far as vanilla was concerned, this was another really big piece of unfinished business that the players could only speculate on what was held inside. And last, but certainly not least, we have Gilneas, another Cataclysm entry here, but on the southern end of the Silverpine Forest, we have Gilneas, the home of the furries. The forces of Ergol have a strong presence within the forest. They're humans turned werewolf by way of a curse, and not just within the lore, but actual gameplay elements with the inhabitants of Shadowprey Village roaming the town in their human form by day and transforming into elite worgen at night. One of the few areas in the game that actually changes depending on the time of day, in fact. If you manage to sneak past the gate, you'll find an empty chasm awaiting you. It's not quite as extravagant as the Cataclysm version, I'd say, but another one of the big mystery areas in vanilla that could definitely have some potential here. First, starting with Ulduar. Ulduar is a facility constructed by the Titans, which are the godlike creators of Azeroth, as a prison for one of the old gods, the king of BJs, Yogg-Saron. The Titans wanted to shape and order the world, sort of, and the old gods opposed them and sought to corrupt it, and eventually the Titans gained the upper hand and started imprisoning the old gods, and Ulduar was created to house Yogg-Saron. So eventually players would of course visit this in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, but believe it or not, it was planned to be in Vanilla World of Warcraft. In fact, it was to be its own entire continent south of Kalimdor. What you're looking at is a concept map all the way back during the game's initial development in 1999. Also funny to note that Kalimdor itself was way smaller, a fraction of the size of the Eastern Kingdoms. So interesting that Cthulhu maybe wouldn't have been the only old god that players would encounter in vanilla. No one can agree on what Classic Plus is, but what I often see are new zones. In the last ones we talked about some unfinished ones here and there, such as Hyjal, Uldum, Kolthalas, and these would eventually be fleshed out in later expansions, and as with Ulduar, but only as an enclosed raid, not a continent, so I think this could have some potential. Really, as far as they got was just this map. They never made the terrain for the zone or any modeling or anything, but it was planned. In the last video, we talked about the mostly abandoned Ashara zone. There's a cut MOBA battleground there, as well as an abandoned dungeon, and somehow I missed the biggest one, and that's the Timbermaw Gate. In the northwestern area of the zone, you'll find a bunch of furbolgs wandering about, and tucked away in the corner is a very large and imposing gate that looks like it was meant to be something. There are a couple of theories as to what. First is another dungeon, Ashara, because the developers realized that a zone that's essentially a giant cliff is really annoying to navigate, was kind of abandoned, and the whole area is ripe for unfinished content, as mentioned earlier, so some theorize that this was intended to be a furbolg dungeon, or maybe possibly even a raid. The other theory, and this one is more interesting I think, is that this was thought to be the fourth entrance to the Timbermaw Hold, which you may know as the series of tunnels connecting Moonglade, Fellwood, and Winterspring together. Inside the tunnel, you can sort of find this out-of-place wall, possibly indicating a quick patch job once the idea was scrapped. And this is where it gets really interesting. Looking at the world map, if this tunnel was indeed connected to Ashara, which is pretty far, it would go right under one of the largest pieces of cut content in vanilla, the zone that we mentioned in the first episode, Mount Hyjal. Now, Hyjal does have a blocked entrance at the end of that elite demon-infested area in Winterspring, where people used to farm for the Eye of Shadow. But as some of you know, when it was finished in Cataclysm, it had those Barrow Den tunnels as part of some quests, so I wonder if maybe the original plan was to connect Ashara here, and halfway between it, it could connect to Mount Hyjal and maybe serve as an alternate entrance where, if you took the time to grind out reputation with the Timbermaw, you could gain safe passage instead of going through this gauntlet of elite demons. If Classic Plus were to ever be a thing, and they were to implement Hyjal, I think this connecting area, as described, would be a really cool addition and sort of knock out 2 pieces of cut content at once. And next, we have the Dalaran bubble in the Altreich Mountains. Dalaran is known as the City of Mages. It was founded after the War of the Ancients during the early days of human civilization, and it became the center for all of the mages in Azeroth, sort of like the Citadel from Game of Thrones, with the Kirin Tor essentially being the maesters. They remained neutral throughout the various conflicts within the world until the Second War, where they rightfully and understandably aided the Alliance against Horde Filth, and during the Third War it was attacked directly by Arthas, who summoned Archimonde inside of it, leading to its destruction. Lore-wise in vanilla, it's being rebuilt, and of course it wouldn't be until Wrath of the Lich King that it would be converted into a floating city, and it would make its way to Northrend and serve as the main hub for that expansion, and then later the same for Legion. I think that the existing major cities of vanilla are a really big part of its identity, so I wouldn't say this being a hub would be the greatest idea, but if we're talking new raid content post Naxxramas, this could be a contender, I think. Like maybe Archimonde forgot his anime pillow or something, and he comes back for it, and it gets taken over by the Legion. We could have a demon raid, something that vanilla didn't have. Kind of a tangent here, but speaking of cut content and giant pink bubbles protecting cities, in the Warlords of Draenor expansion, you might remember that Shatrath City had the same giant bubble protecting it, and it was surrounded by an army of elite demons. This ended up being Draenor's missing raid, as evidenced by this early screenshot. So, Draenor today has the reputation of being one of the weaker expansions for a while, for many reasons. One of them being the fact that there were just 3 raids. Blizzard sort of half-jokingly stated for many years that in order to implement player housing, they would have to sacrifice a raid tier, so some think that the garrisons in Draenor was the reason for this, and in fact if you go to the graveyard in the garrison, you'll find a marker labeled Raid D tier. Yeah, like I said, kind of a tangent, but kind of funny that there are 2 instances of unfinished content involving cities sheltered by pink bubbles. And speaking of cities, next we have one of the most legendary unfinished areas of vanilla. I can't believe I didn't mention this in the last one, but that's Old Ironforge. So this isn't to be confused with Alpha Ironforge, which is essentially the same as the one we're accustomed to, but with 2 separate levels. Unlike many other things in this list, this wasn't scrapped due to time constraints, but instead from feedback that it was just too confusing and difficult to navigate, which eventually led to them downsizing it to 1 level. But they did leave behind an artifact from this Alpha Ironforge. In the King's Room, you may have noticed a conspicuous gate off to the left side. Behind these gates lies a big secret, and there were a few methods of getting into it. The one that I remember is that at a certain point in the game's history, for some reason you could initiate a duel right here next to the mailbox near the bank, and if you started it and you made a beeline all the way around to King Magni's room, you could reset the expiration timer by going near his throne, and then you would have one player stand near the door, and you would either sheep or fear them so they get forced through, and what they would find would be an abandoned tunnel system leading to the core of Ironforge, this remnant of the original Alpha. And this is one of the ultimate secret hidden areas in the game that players would glitch through. Going up the stairs, you have this sort of ritual area, and taking a right at the fork, it sort of loops around, and you have this precarious climb along some ridges overhanging a pit of lava. As players would eventually find, this area would be finished in the Cataclysm expansion, where Magni is crystallized due to a curse, until the Battle of Azeroth, where he starts performing sexual favors for an addictive drug called Azerite.
Champion, I can sense Azerite nearby.
In the last episode, we went over some areas that would eventually be finished in the first expansion, the Burning Crusade, such as Karazhan or Kolthalas, but there is much more. In fact, all of the Outland was planned to be in vanilla, and it was just later pushed back to the Burning Crusade, again due to the time constraints. But what you're looking at here is the original Hellfire Peninsula, which is as far as they made it. It's pretty recognizable, but at the same time different. Here's what the original Dark Portal looked like before they actually added stairs. Here's Honor Hold, Zethgor. The area overall seems to be much more open, and there are more lingering signs of life compared to its Burning Crusade counterpart. You may recognize the reuse of the giant mushrooms from the Eastern Plague Lands. The pools of Agonar are also still present, although his remains are much smaller compared to the final release. And off the map, past a void, can be found some Silithid hides, like what would you find in Silithus, and even some ruins from Tanarus. The zone overall was absolutely huge, and it must have been a really big blow to put so much into it for it to ultimately never see the light of day. Similarly, we also have what people refer to as Old Outland. This is a much smaller entry, and of all places, you'll actually find it in the Dead Mines. By clipping through the wall in the beginning and doing some tricky floating aimed just right, you land on target to a pretty large mass of land, but with really only one thing going on at the center here, with a collection of some of the floating trees that were also found in the old Hellfire Peninsula hovering over this void chasm. So this is clearly just a bit of experimenting by the developers back in the day that didn't really amount to too much, but it became one of the more iconic hidden areas for explorers willing to boundary break. Not really sure for its potential in Classic Plus, but just a cool area that I thought was worth mentioning. But zones weren't the only thing that were pushed back. In fact, as far as pre-alpha, it was planned that players would be able to level from 1 to 70 in vanilla through those missing zones, and one of them was going to be the Dragon Isles. So in the latest expansion, Dragonflight, players have begun to explore the finished version of these isles, but as evidenced by this early development screenshot, they were supposed to be in the game in 2004. In fact, there even exists a map. As for why it was abandoned, as John Statz described in his book, The Warcraft Diary, it just didn't really make sense in the lore since the dragons are mostly good. You have Alex Straza as the Red Ranger, Ysera as the Green, Malagos the Blue, Nazdormu for Yellow. Did you know that the Power Rangers was 2 shows spliced together? The action portion was actually a Japanese program called Super Sentai, and then the teenage drama portion was filmed to give them backstories and personalities. Anyways, the point being here, the villain Dragonflight at the time was Deathwing, and the Black Dragonflight, whom players had encounters with via the Onyxia and Nefarian fights. So having an entire continent with just one Dragonflight as an enemy felt like it would be too repetitive for players. Shoutouts to the Warlords of Draenor, by the way. And probably due to time constraints, the whole thing was scrapped until, as it turns out, 2022 with the Dragonflight expansion. They did get as far as some model and terrain work for the zone, with some completely unique buildings that never made it into the game, curiously enough. And as evidenced by the screenshot, there's even to be a raid here. I can only imagine that this giant palace would have been it. It's actually an absolutely enormous zone, so again, it must have been a pretty big blow to put all of this work into it, only ending up having to scrap it. We're going to explore the long-lost Alpha 0.5.3 client. This was the first publicly playable version of the game, and a little fun fact of the history is that this was the version that was leaked out during the internal alpha testing. A person by the name of Skull socially engineered either a tester or an employee of Blizzard themselves, and they leaked it to the internet, where people began reverse engineering it and then making server software, which marked the birth of the private server community. To start off here, interestingly enough, cut content can be found from official Blizzard literature. For those of you who have the original game manuals, if you flip to the classes page, you'll find a race-class combination that never made it to vanilla, which is the Dwarven Mage. This was said to be cut not for lore reasons necessarily, but rather because the developers felt like the Alliance had more freedom with race and class combinations, so in classic Blizzard fashion, instead of increasing the combinations for Horde, they piss off everybody by removing this particular one for the Alliance. But this wouldn't be the only interesting thing in the manual. If you were to look at the races section, you would also find the original troll models. These have become rather infamous over the years for their ugliness, for a lack of a better term. They were changed to be a little bit more appealing to the eye because all of the beautiful people were on the Alliance, not just in real life, but in-game as well. And this would be something that would be taken a step further in the Burning Crusade expansion when, controversially, the Blood Elves were added, which was a pretty big deal back then because they didn't really mesh with the aesthetic that the Horde had at the time.
I can't believe that they gave us fucking Blood Elves. They're not evil. You ever go to fucking Blood Elf City Silvermoon? All these fucking pretty colors and shit.
And this wasn't the only model change. A keen eye can notice very slight differences in posture and even animations with pretty much every race and sex in this alpha. Apparently, Blizzard felt that they were a little too roughshod, and they gave model and animation updates across the board sometime during the beta. Next, we have an actual feature, and that's the original talent system. In vanilla, as you know, all classes eventually landed on the talent tree system, where each level you gain attributes and a talent point to spend in 3 different trees that drastically change the gameplay of your character. Before that, though, they were much more classic D&D RPG-like, where attributes weren't automatically granted upon level, but instead were chosen. Each level you would gain talent points, and you could spend them on a variety of different things, such as attributes, defensive talents such as dodge, regeneration, shield blocking, armor, magic resists, or offensive talents would be increased damage versus certain enemy types like beasts or humanoids, or interestingly enough, even the ability to track them, which was, of course, eventually given to hunters. You could specialize in different weapon types and increase their attack rating, like one-handed and two-handed maces, swords, axes, depending on your class. The system was eventually scrapped based on the premise that it offered the illusion of choice, and everybody just picked the best talents, so it didn't really have any reason to exist. And this would be true to some extent with the reworked system, but on the flip side, there were a few different builds for each class that offered pretty varied playstyles, such as the subtlety PvP rogue versus combat PvE, or a tanky demonology warlock versus the glass cannon destruction, to name just a couple of examples. In vanilla, you probably know about weapon skills. You get a new weapon, train it, and flail wildly at enemies, missing 90% of your attacks because your weapon skill is too low. Well, originally, magic functioned similarly, where each time you used a spell, the appropriate magic school would increase in skill level. So, cast a fireball, gain skill in fire, you throw out a heal, gain skill in holy magic, and so on. In the release, the skill is still in the game, but it was changed to just level up automatically every time that the players level up. Next, going back to cut content, we have the Undermine. Early pre-release maps reveal that it was intended for vanilla in 2004. Undermine is a sprawling subterranean city nestled beneath the island of Kazan in the southern Sea of Azeroth near the Maelstrom, and it's basically the home of the goblins, who remained neutral throughout the game until the Cataclysm, where they joined the Filthy Horde. It's renowned for its elusive goblin trade princes, who command private armies and expansive trade fleets, and turning it into a frenetic center of commerce and intrigue. In previous episodes, we discussed these unreleased areas and items under the context of possible Classic Plus content. You can't really get closer to the spirit of vanilla than areas that were actually planned in vanilla. And although this never made it past this concept stage, it was seriously considered at one point, and it could have some potential in this undefinable Classic Plus that people talk about. It could be maybe a raid tier or something. In a previous episode, we briefly mentioned Alpha Ironforge, and I figured it was big enough to warrant a full tour here. So the first thing you'll notice is that King Magni's statue is missing, and entering the city, that main square that held the bank and auction house is also gone completely. There are now 2 rings, an inner and an outer, with 2 floors across the outer ring, with the important buildings that you know, such as the military wing or the mystic wing and so on, being on the 2nd floor. As for the Hall of Explorers, it looks pretty similar, with one exception being the flight path nearby. As for the inner ring, some other important areas can be found, such as the Forlorn Cavern, where rogues found their trainers. You can also find the bank here, complete with guards falling out of the sky, and also Old Ironforge, as it's known, which we showed off in a previous episode since it was tucked away in the throne room in the new version. In this version, this was the actual throne room where King Magni resided, brooding that they haven't finished his statue yet. The Deep Run tram can also be found in this inner ring. You get there by way of an elevator, and it looks very different. You'll recognize the architecture from Gnomeregan, and holy shit!
Come and play with us, Daddy, forever and ever and ever.
Okay, that's scary. The trams were never implemented before the remodel, but there are 2 different directions where it splits off to. It's theorized that this would take you not only to Stormwind, but also Darnassus. Obviously, in the final version, we only got Stormwind, which, if you're curious on the other side of things, what would eventually be the Deep Run Tram entrance is just a brick wall. So the reason why all of this was changed was that players kept getting lost, which isn't surprising considering that the map wasn't even available in this version of the game. But anyways, for the next one, going back to Stormwind, you'll notice that one of the attractions in a previous episode, that scrapped housing district, is also missing. And that's because at this point, players were actually able to place houses themselves. So this was a very short-lived feature. But yes, Blizzard did at one point give players the ability to find a spot in Azeroth to plop down a house. This went through a few iterations actually. There was another landmass set aside, mainly for testing, that actually existed in the world, as placing them anywhere in Azeroth, you would run into obvious issues such as blocking off critical questing areas, to name just one. This eventually fell through because the real estate was just too scarce, and they were already struggling fitting the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor into their own instances. In fact, one of the reasons, besides time, that the Outland was pushed back into its own expansion was because they simply didn't have room for it. So after all of this, eventually, as said, they had plans to make their own housing instance in Stormwind, probably somewhere else in Orgrimmar for the Horde, but that didn't pan out. And it would stay that way until Draenor, which had the infamous garrison system, which had its own host of issues that we'll save for another time. Don't worry, we'll do another episode about that expansion entirely at some point. And next, we have an oldie but a goodie, and that's the survivalist profession. So this was a scrapped profession removed in the beta of the game, intended to aid players in traversing the world of Azeroth. As it turned out, the ability to make campfires was given to cooks, but this was originally a survival skill, along with the ability to light torches. You see, at some point, the dark areas in Azeroth were really dark, and they required the use of torches to be able to see where you were going, as well as giving you spirit. The way it worked was that you bought the torches from vendors, and then you lit them at campfires, and they would only last for a short amount of time. It's sort of like that crypt area in Dark Souls where you needed to use that skull lantern, for those of you who played that game. The campfires functioned pretty similarly, providing a spirit buff to those who sit near it, as well as allowing players to cook food, which made it for a good pair for cooking back when it was a primary profession. So this too has a lot of potential for Classic Plus. It's even been explored on private servers such as Turtle WoW. It would be a pretty interesting hardcore touch, I think, to have areas or maybe even dungeons and raids where they're pitch black and they require torches to navigate certain areas. Maybe a boss fight that requires torches in order to fight them. First up, we have a feature. In vanilla, anybody who's at all familiar with the Hunter class knows that the different pet species in the game hold different unique abilities. The spiders can root people in place, the bird has an AoE threat generator, the wolf provides a melee attack power buff for party members, and beyond all of this, they also come with unique stats, and with the loyalty and training systems, they're arguably one of the most complex classes in vanilla. Well, as it turns out, this system functioned very differently in the alpha. To train different species at first, you had to track down these specialized trainers spread throughout the world that would give you the ability to tame them, as well as learn unique abilities such as for the spider, you can get a poison dot, the web which you know, and a ranged poison spit. As for the tall striders, they were more supportive, putting a debuff that increases damage taken, or healing a friendly target, or increasing regeneration rate. In general, they were much more unique than what they eventually landed on. How it worked was you learned the ability to train it from these trainers, and similar to the beast training skill in 1.0, the hunter would teach it to the pet once they reached the appropriate level. Although at this point there were no pet skill points that she had to allocate. But that's not the only difference. The class saw many changes throughout its development. Some of you may know that along with rogues, they could actually use bucklers. In the alpha, there were two shield types, shields and bucklers, where the latter was a more lightweight version having less armor and block, giving these two classes a more defensive feel. Auto shot wasn't in, meaning that you had to manually shoot every single time, and the cast speed would match that of your ranged weapon. Many remember focus as a cataclysm change, but it was indeed the first resource for hunters in this alpha. It would build slowly over time, and your abilities would consume it, and as for the abilities themselves, they're all quite different as well. Beast Call was a taunt that only worked on beasts, so maybe there was some sort of tanking capability planned for hunters at some point. As for Charm Beast, this would tame a beast for only 1 minute. Soothe Beast was a crowd control. True Shot wasn't an aura, it was an attack instead, costing 2 focus and adding some damage, and an additional 1 second cast time. Blinding Shot reduced your chance to hit. Fire Shot did some elemental fire damage. Quick Shot added 5 damage to a shot with a 1 minute cooldown. And Silencing Shot, which eventually turned up in the Burning Crusade, silenced the target for an insane 8 seconds, if you can actually believe that. Explosive Shot, which we saw in Wrath eventually, was in the alpha as well. This also did some AoE damage, and Sniper Shot added a whopping 5-second cast time to your weapon for some heavy damage, similar to Aimed Shot. Running Shot could be cast on the move. The closest thing we eventually got was Aspect of the Fox in Cataclysm, where you could use Steady Shot on the move. As for Frost Shot, this dealt some frost damage and also slowed your enemy, and Stalking was the early version of Hunter's Mark. Like with every class, there were no talents, as at this point it was the skill point system, so this, along with those pet abilities, was essentially their entire toolkit. There were no traps, there were no aspects, it was all quite bare bones, which makes sense because Hunters were the last class that was added to the game for vanilla. Next, doing an area. The Scarlet Monastery is perhaps one of the most memorable dungeons in vanilla. It's split up into 4 wings: the graveyard, library, armory, and cathedral, and it's often the first thing that people think of when they think of vanilla dungeons. The bosses are memorable, the loot is really good, the XP is pretty decent, and the lore is interesting. But this was all the result of a lot of hard work and a huge makeover, as in the alpha, it was all one big dungeon, with just one entrance at the bottom of the stairs leading into the monastery, which is even blocked off by a couple of gates, which possibly indicates that there may have been plans for an attunement or a key required to gain entry. So the first difference you'll notice is that the entrance to the library and graveyard are missing, and the cathedral and armory paths are actually the same hallway, so right away it's a very linear dungeon compared to the updated version. Turning the corner, we have the library. Over to the right is the Houndmaster and his hounds, but going through the next area, we find that it goes right instead of left, and right around the corner, we have the Wish.com version of Mad Season. Herod. Yeah, really, you do actually enter his room from the bottom floor here, right after the Houndmaster, which is pretty wild, and you probably noticed that he had a wardrobe change. I guess this is before he flexed off all of his armor. A little fun fact here is that this red-winged helmet that he's wearing was actually the original Lightbringer helmet model, and I remember this because my first 60 back in the day was a Paladin, and I thought it was so cool looking, but by the time I got it, they changed it to the McDonald's hat, which was pretty disappointing. Anyways, moving past him up the stairs that used to be the entrance to his room, the hallway leads left instead of right, and at the end of the hallway you can go left or right. Going left leads to the graveyard. You may recognize this as Interrogator Vicious's room, who switched tables, and as you can see, the Undead Quest Giver is also missing. And following through here, we have another long hallway, and where you would normally expect that big courtyard with a lot of undead wandering about, eventually leading to the Blood Mage Thalnos inside his crypt, you'll instead find a copy of that little square in library that held the Houndmaster. So his house got quite the upsize in the new version. But going back to the fork in the road and going right this time, we find the library, and where Thalnos had a smaller room, Doan doesn't even have a room at all. He's not in this version, and the next room is instead the final cathedral with Mulgrain and Whitemane. The main difference being is that there's some benches added, along with various other little changes, such as Mulgrain being gray-haired, and Whitemane, who is hatless.
Suspect is hatless. Repeat, hatless.
You can also find Inquisitor Fairbanks hanging out in his room, although they haven't installed the secret bookshelf yet. So in terms of square footage and mob density, it's much smaller than the 4-wing update that was eventually released. I think the 4-wing version was a big improvement, so kudos to the developers for that. But it is interesting to see all of these bosses right next to each other, sort of like an alternate reality Scarlet Monastery. Next we have Death, Resurrection, and XP, which all worked a little bit differently in this alpha. In the final version, as you know, when you died, you lost 10% equipped durability, and you'd spawn in ghost form to the nearest spirit healer, where you had the option of either running back to your corpse or rezzing at the spirit healer for a 10-minute debuff and an additional 25% durability hit to all of your gear in your bags, not just your equipped items. However, in the alpha, you would instead set your revive point to an NPC known as a binder, and if you ever died, no matter where you were, you would revive at this binder, as well as lose some experience. As you may know, one of the game's selling points was that it was much more casual friendly compared to other games in the genre at the time, so they would eventually do away with this XP loss and replace it with the fatigue system, where the more you adventured, the more you fatigued your character, reducing the amount of XP you gained. You could still rest by logging off in an inn or major city to recover it, which would eventually give you times 2 XP, and you had normal, which is times 1, but if you played too much, you would get fatigued, which would be half, and then exhausted was a quarter. This was all eventually done away with because it just discouraged playing too much, and it forced grinding as players would just simply run out of quests. Since this was before players had widespread knowledge of the game and these advanced database websites, even without penalties, making it to 60 usually required some form of mob grinding or dungeon spam to some extent, so this was a little bit too punishing for what they were going for, and they eventually got rid of the penalties, but they did keep the times 2 rested bonus. And next, going over various locations and references that were removed. This is quite a popular one. The first is the Statue of Liberty in Stranglethorn Vale on Jaguaro Island, which was the spot where you did that Donkey Kong reference quest for Princess Mooba. You can also find the Statue of Liberty, clearly unfinished because I don't particularly remember it being hot pink, but this is a reference to the movie The Planet of the Apes. Spoiler alert, but the story goes that a group of astronauts go on a space mission, and after an accident, they crash land on this planet filled with intelligent evolved apes who hunt down humans for sport and slavery. And at the end, the protagonist, Taylor, finds the half-buried Statue of Liberty, revealing that they had traveled into the future to this post-apocalyptic Earth after the world's superpowers blew it up. It was one of the many commentaries on the Cold War. In the last one, we did a little tour of Alpha Ironforge, which was wildly different, so I figured we'd do the same with Stormwind here, which holds some differences. Not as extreme, but there are some notable ones, such as first noticing that the lighting and the torches are a bit different. The bridge leading to the stockades is really steep for some reason, and there's now a river that covers that spot between the trade district and the mage quarter, making it harder to navigate. You can't jump in the water in this version of the game, which makes sense if you think about it, but it's also pretty annoying as you have to swim all the way to the little pier to get back up. They eventually changed it because people were falling in water in certain spots of the game and were getting themselves stuck with no way out. As it happens, this was also before Hearthstones were added into the game, so they would either have a GM get them out or essentially abandon their character. In the park, there's a Tall Strider trainer for hunters, and in the Dwarven district, a Raptor trainer, and the entrance to the Deep Run tram is blocked off like I mentioned in the last video. The auction house is missing, which was actually true for the 1.0 release as well. Initially, only Ironforge and Orgrimmar had auction houses, and they were later added to other cities, and they weren't even linked until a certain patch, meaning that the ones in Darnassus and Thunderbluff would be pretty barren of items most of the time. The bank in the trade district is much larger than the version we eventually got, and the portal in the Mage Tower is gone. I guess they needed to add a little more room for NPCs at some point. And in the keep, you'll find that Anixia, aka Lady Prestor, is replaced by Davil Prestor II, and Bolvar is cosplaying as Colonel Curzon from Stranglethorn. In Old Town, we see that the PvP hall is missing, with some rogue vendors who just kind of took up shop where it used to be, and the SI7 building isn't even there yet, holding just this open courtyard with Matthias Shaw just hanging out. The same is true for the Warrior building. Right now it's just this open area with a few trainers here and there. There's a bunch of other tiny, minor differences here and there that you can probably spot if you have a keen eye, but I think that about wraps up this episode. So starting off with some stuff I missed from the previous episode, when I was showing off Old Stormwind, I mentioned that right outside of the stockades there was this canal blocking off that little section outside the Mage Quarter, but I neglected to go into the actual dungeon itself. Stockades is the smallest dungeon in the game, but in the alpha it's even smaller because it's missing an entire wing. The western wing, which held Dextrin Ward, is gone completely, and he's moved over right next to Basil Thread in the eastern wing. And another thing, when I was showing off all of the weird hunter abilities, I forgot to mention that some of them actually required reagents to cast. Fire Shot needed something called Fire Tar, Starburst, which was the flare, required an explosive shell, as did Explosive Shot. You could also only use this ability with a gun, and for Frost Shot, you needed a Frost Vial. You could just buy all of these reagents from a vendor, but pretty interesting to note that along with the ammo requirement and the eventual pet happiness and loyalty systems, hunters had a lot of maintenance going on, which I imagine would be the reason for the removal of these abilities and the reagents to cast them. But nonetheless, it's pretty interesting. Next up, we have what I teased in the last episode, and that's the original island of Cardero in the Western Plaguelands. This used to be a fortress in the Kingdom of Lordaeron, and it was invaded by the Horde during the Second War, and it was destroyed and eventually restored, where the Barov family took up residence. They eventually allied with Kel'Thuzad and became a hideout of the Cult of the Damned, where they taught followers the forbidden art of necromancy, and of course was known to the players as Scholomance. So as you may know, this is where you could find the entrance to the dungeon, and the first difference you'll notice here is that there is no bridge connecting the island to the mainland, forcing a swim, and once you enter you'll find a couple of destroyed buildings strewn about, and a dark portal entrance. Wait, what? Well, if you watched episode 1 of this series, you would know that they just used this for a placeholder for dungeon entrances at the time, and obviously this would eventually become Scholomance. And in case you were wondering, it is inactive at this point, and nothing happens when you try to zone through it. But there's actually a bit of history going on with this dungeon. It originally wasn't even going to be an instance. One of the things that the game hyped up on its release were micro-dungeons, which were essentially those large cave systems spread throughout the game. For example, the cave atop the altar of Jintha Alor in the Hinterlands is a micro-dungeon. So, although it's pretty standard today, it was apparently a pretty big feature back then to have these cave systems, and Scholomance was going to be one such micro-dungeon, but the developers had made it big enough to warrant an evolution into an actual instance dungeon. So what you're seeing right here is actually the second version of Scholomance. Next, while we're in the area, it's also worth covering Anderhall. This was once a prosperous city in northern Lordaeron, similar to Hearthglen or Stratholme, and it ended up being one of the casualties of the Scourge outbreak that destroyed the land, with a lich known as Araj the Summoner eventually using it as a base of operations to spread corruption across the land via those plague cauldrons that you might remember if you ever quested here. In the alpha, the town is bigger and also more intact. There are now walls surrounding the city, making it harder to navigate. And if you remember the 1.0 release, most of the buildings were completely blown apart, leaving only the foundation. In this version, they're still relatively intact. And if you're curious, Araj the Summoner is in his usual spot, although he has that Blood Mage model instead of the Lich. And as for Chromie, she's not yet added in this version, and her building is completely empty. Next, moving on to a system, we have professions, which functioned pretty differently. As you know, in release, you could have 2 primary professions and all 3 secondaries, but in the alpha, it was a little less restrictive. First is there were no primary nor secondary professions, and the way it worked was that every level you gained a skill point, and then you could spend these skill points to train any profession that you want. Apprentice cost 1, Journeyman cost 3, Expert 5, Master 10, unless it's fishing, cooking, or first aid, which have reduced costs. As an aside, first aid also had a straight up heal, a 5-second cast on a 1-minute cooldown, which is pretty crazy. But back to professions, that was it. That was the only restriction, meaning that if you wanted to, you could learn Journeyman of everything and be sort of this jack of all trades and master of none. Just to throw in our complimentary Star Wars Galaxies mention in my World of Warcraft video, it is actually pretty similar to the class system in that game, where you're given a certain amount of skill points and you then distribute those between a variety of professions of your choice, and you could create these weird hybrid builds. I would even go as far to say that this alpha system may have even been inspired directly by SWG. But a lot more freedom regardless, and it's pretty interesting, I thought. In a previous episode, we talked about the different forms of player housing that existed. The first being where you could initially just place them in the world, to the abandoned housing district in Stormwind, and eventually garrisons in Draenor. And I just wanted to show you the first in action here because I missed it last time. This is what it would have looked like had it made it into the game. And you can probably tell the issue already, as it would just block people off from critical quest mobs, and this entire zone would just be littered with houses. you wouldn't even be able to move. So, it's an interesting idea. The player housing debate still rages on to this day, but these are the origins if you were curious. You may have spied earlier when talking about professions that languages are also considered a skill. The undead race was actually pretty unique because they would be the only race who could communicate cross-faction. Of course, as you would imagine, once being a human, they'd retain the common language, so they had this unique flair to them where it was eventually changed due to Blizzard wanting to maintain a barrier between the two factions in the game. Actually, if you really want to know something crazy, in its very early years, there weren't even going to be factions, period. Orcs and humans and trolls and dwarves and so on would all be able to play with each other, which is kind of interesting because today, as far as I know with retail, since the Alliance are so vastly outnumbered because I quit the game and they lost their hero, the players have sort of been calling for an end of factions. As far as I know, Blizzard has sort of met them halfway by allowing them to raid together. And there's some other cross-faction elements such as the mercenary mode for PvP when the queues are imbalanced. But honestly, you guys probably know more about retail than I do at this point. And also, since we just mentioned undead, another interesting thing is that they were actually considered the undead type initially, meaning that they would be immune to fear, but they would be susceptible to shackle or exorcism or turn undead. But this was later changed for balance reasons. But next, in the last episode, as I said, we went over the hunter and how different they were. So I wanted to do the same here with mages because they actually have some interesting stuff going on. First is we have Khadgar's unlocking, which would function similarly to the rogue's lockpick. They eventually removed this because they felt that rogues were a little too plain in that they were just straight damage dealers. So they wanted them to have a bit of unique flair by removing this from mages. On the same vein, we also have invisibility, which they eventually saw added back to the game after vanilla. But they did have it in this alpha, which would of course allow them to be able to stealth, which is just crazy considering how powerful they already were. During the alpha testing of the game, there's this undead mage who would trick low-level Alliance by yelling in gutter speak to come to the bridge away from the guards in Red Ridge for free gold, at which point he would cook up a pyroblast while invisible and one-shot them. Maybe that's why they removed both invisibility and cross-faction communication. Some developer got butt blasted by this guy, and he coded it out of the game in a fit of rage. Water Elemental, most players know, was a Burning Crusade edition, but mages did already have it in the alpha in the Frost Magic tree. It has a 3-minute cooldown, it lasts for a minute, but it doesn't seem to have that AoE root that it eventually got. And something I want to point out here as well is that pretty much all of these classes, mage included, are still very barebone, only holding a handful of spells per school. Remember, there's no talent system right now, so what you're looking at is their entire toolkit, so they definitely came a long way by the time release came. Next, we have a model change. So this actually made it to 1.0, and it was changed pretty early on in the game, but ogres were originally a little bit more tubby. They got more of a dad bod here, and I personally remember when this change went in, I was grinding on the ogre mound in Duskwood on my warrior, and I logged out there for the night, and the next day I logged into this model change, and it looked like they all hit the gym overnight. I happen to prefer the old model actually, but that might also be because I think that everything that is old is superior to everything that is new, because I am a depressed classic World of Warcraft player. Moving on, another environment difference here is in Loch Modan with the Stonerot Dam. It's much larger than the 1.0 version, but also more barren. Side note here, I always like to take feedback with everything. There are probably hundreds of these more kind of minor differences like this. For example, here's that infamous Yeti cave in Hillsbrad where you always died on PvP servers. As you can see, it used to be that smaller version. But my question is, do you guys want to see the more minor stuff like this in future episodes? Or should I just stick to the big stuff like Alpha Ironforge, for instance, in comparison? So yeah, let me know in the comments because I can do either. Speaking of which though, I guess for this video I'll just keep doing this little stuff for now. But Booty Bay looked a little bit different. At this point the boat system was still in the works, so you'll notice that the ships are permanently docked here. Of course, in release, to travel between the two continents, players would have to wait for the actual physical boat or zeppelin to sail in, and then wait for it to cross over. This all wasn't finished yet, so for now, you just had these Boatmaster NPCs breaking kayfabe by saying, hey, be patient, we're still working on this crap, but for now you can just teleport if you want. If you're curious what the other ones looked like, here's Ratchet, which also looks pretty different, and one of these NPCs became quite popular. There's Captain Placeholder, who resides in Menethil, and as for the docks, as you'll see, they're much smaller. Here's what Darkshore looked like. And as for Theramore, it actually has 2 docks. One goes to Menethil, and the other goes nowhere, as there's no Boatmaster. So some sort of abandoned plans here for something. Maybe it was to go to Uldum or something, or one of those abandoned islands that we talked about in previous episodes. But you may be asking yourself that, if the boats aren't working, how do you get back and forth between Darnassus and Darkshore? Well, the answer to that is, like in release, it's by bird, but here it's the only option. In 1.0, you had that teleport that went to Ruthrin Village, where you could go either by boat or hippogriff, but in the alpha that's yet to be added, both the boat system and Ruthrin Village as a whole, and in the place of the teleport is just a platform with a flight master. So to the west of Westfall, we find a couple of islands that never made it into the game, first covering the northernmost, Gilligan's. This is most definitely a reference to the 70s TV sitcom Gilligan's Island, where after a storm, a ship set ground on the shore of this uncharted desert isle, and the island itself is actually quite massive. Judging from the map, it's about the size of Deadwind Pass. I'll give you a pretty thorough tour here. Starting on the docks on the southern end of the island, you'll notice a lot of the environment and architecture is quite similar to Stranglethorn, which makes sense because it's not too far from here. And going up the hill, we have this little cave and camp area with a giant turkey being spit roasted. This leads to a fork in the road where you can go straight or up. Going up leads to another small camp with a tent. I imagine that this would have been a little quest hub area, like that rebel camp in Stranglethorn or something. But heading back down and following the path straight leads to another fork where you can either go forward or check out the beach. Going to the beach first, we have some of those turtle skeletons that you would find in Darkshore, and it goes on for a little while until you can see some ruins to the right. And going through here, we actually have a few different ways to go. There's another beach, there's a bridge leading to some more ruins, or a side path. Following the side path, there's another fork. Going straight leads you back to where we started, and going across the bridge leads you to the northern part of the island. To the left is a small cliff area with not a whole lot going on, but if you were to go right, we have this happy little waterfall, and interestingly enough, an actual NPC, which is kind of rare for unfinished areas. It's a naked human in sort of a locked pose. You can't interact with them, unfortunately, but clearly there were some plans for a little questing area here of some sort. If you notice, there's also some random paths strewn about, so it's a pretty early work in progress. But heading back across the bridge, let's go check out the ruins that we walked by. The bridge is actually broken and requires a jump, and you're met with 3 more paths. One is just a single room cave, which is of course empty, and going down the stairs, it splits off into more stairs leading nowhere, a shore to the river that separates the 2 islands, and a small cave system. Who knows what it would have held, but if I remember correctly, these were most typically used for ogre caves. You have that ogre mound in Duskwood, and also in Alterac, and considering that there is an ogre presence in Stranglethorn, maybe they also had a little island here as well. I mean, that was a pretty big turkey back there. Heading out though, and going up the hill to the right, exiting the cave, we have another creepy NPC just hanging out, and behind him, a wrecked ship. Probably a reference again to the Gilligan's Isle sitcom. This is where they would have crash landed maybe, and maybe this guy is Gilligan or Skipper or whatever. You know, everybody's like Ginger or Marianne. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here like, what about Mrs. Howell? Oh, Thurston! Like I said, this is the smaller of the 2 islands, so let's go north and check out the island of Dr. Lepidus. Starting from the eastern beach, you'll see that it's mostly empty plains until you reach a fork where you can go straight to some ruins or right up a hill. And going right first is a traversable yet fairly empty area with not really a whole lot going on. But going back and going to the ruins and going across the bridge, you'll find it's pretty intricate. I'd say that it's approximately maybe half the size of Zul'Gurub, and instead of narrating it all, I figured I would just show you here because it is quite a big area and there are a ton of nooks and crannies to explore. There definitely was a lot of work put into this area. Exiting the ruins, we have this glitched bridge that phases into the ground, and following that we have a pretty open area with a little cave and two directions, a beach or further into the jungle. Going to the beach, you'll find more ruins scattered about, and here it's also we find evidence of quest hubs potentially with camps and equipment strewn about, so maybe you were to land on this western end of the island via boat from Booty Bay or something. These islands are in fatigue waters, so you weren't meant to swim to them, and non-continental boat travel is of course established, like in Fairless for the Alliance for example. Before heading back and further into the jungle, if you followed the dry river south, you would have found another one of those small cave systems. Of course, it's empty like everything else here. And finally going deeper into the jungle near that smaller cave and heading north, you'll see just how much work was put into this area with all the foliage. If I were to show you a random screenshot, you'd probably guess that this is Stranglethorn Vale. You'll soon come to another split in the road where you can go left or right. Going right leads to a little compound with houses and a sawmill and a giant berry popsicle that the locals worship. Nah, just kidding. This is one of those binding stones that we discussed in a previous episode. For some reason it's just untextured here, but there would have eventually been an NPC to bind you here where you would res every time you died. And as for the compound, it's pretty reminiscent of the Curzon area in northeast Stranglethorn actually. It uses a lot of the same assets and buildings and whatnot. It also has that abandoned inn from Moonbrook and some really messed up docks and also an oil platform that doesn't have any collision. So considering the docks, maybe this is actually where you would have landed to start the island. But heading back to the fork and going left this time, we have another split. Going right leads to one of those big mage towers. I wonder if maybe this is where Dr. Lepidus resided. Maybe he was the big bad of the area to serve as the finale or something. But going the other way, we reach a dead end with this little tannery thing to mark that it's a work in progress. So it's 2003, it's 2 a.m. at Blizzard headquarters. Some developer ran out of breast milk and said, screw this crap, I'll finish it later. But the later never came. I don't know, maybe he got fired for cube crawling or something. But that's pretty much it. There is more landmass beyond this point, but since you're obviously not meant to reach it yet, it's all very barren. Sort of like those out-of-bounds areas that you would find all over Eastern Kingdoms in Kalimdor. But these are two pretty huge land masses that had a decent amount of work put into them for them to never see the light of day. Stranglethorn is level 30 to 40-ish, but you kind of need to supplement it with other areas like Desolus, which is across the world, so maybe that's a result of them just running out of time and cutting these places out. I could definitely see these areas being done alongside Stranglethorn, or maybe they were even meant to be high-level elite areas like Tyr's Hand in the Eastern Plaguelands, for example. But pretty cool and interesting nonetheless that even after 20 years there's still stuff that I've never seen in this game. I'm not sure about you guys. Next, doing another class here. Priest was pretty different in its original inception, specifically Discipline. They were more inspired from Dungeons and Dragons because they had a melee component to them. This was largely abandoned by release, but there was some evidence still lingering about, such as in 1.0, their inner fire spell increasing melee attack power, which just mystified players back then. Although this was eventually removed, the chaplains in the Scarlet Monastery dungeon still retained it. So this is what a melee priest would have looked like. Aside from that, there are also various cloth items in the game that have like strength and agility on them, which most just chalked up to weird itemization, but in reality, it was tailored for the cloth melee class. But aside from all that, in the alpha, they also had some interesting stuff going on, such as the ability to sleep any target. As you may know, this was eventually given to druids in the form of Hibernate, but only for beasts and Dragonkin. You're probably familiar with their power word spells. At this time, they were called Holy Word, which functioned the same except for Shield, which had a different graphic, and it also didn't give you the weakened soul debuff, which combined with its short cooldown made it incredibly overpowered. In vanilla, there only ended up being one shadow word, and that was Pain, which was a dot, which is the same in the alpha, but they had a couple of others at this point. There was Befuddle, which slowed casting speed, and also Fumble, which reduced a target's chance to hit by 75% for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Mind Control was called Dominate. Abolish Disease was Nullified Disease, which also granted immunity for a short time. Resurrection was usable in combat. That's not just a priest thing, that would also be true for paladins and shamans, but all of this was later nerfed and combat res was given to druids. And as for Inner Fire, its very first form here was just a straight damage and armor increase, but all those spells and what you're seeing in front of you is the entire toolkit of the priest, so obviously very early stages here. In a previous episode, we went over Alpha Stormwind, so I figured I'd show the Horde a little love here with Alpha Orgrimmar, which is pretty different. First entering the city, we have a boar trainer. If you've been watching this series, you'd know how hunters needed to train specific pet abilities from these specialized trainers, so here's where you would have gotten the boar spells for the Horde. Another thing you'll notice is that the guards have a different look, but entering the city, you'll find that there's no auction house yet. The bank looks a little different, and it's harder to navigate because that little ridge that connected the flight path tower to the PvP building and the Valley of Spirit is gone now. In fact, the entire Valley of Spirit is missing in this version. It's just a long, skinny path leading to the back entrance of the city. Also, in this version, this is where you boarded the Zeppelin, which, if you remember, that was a change in the Cataclysm expansion version of the city, but little did we know, this was actually the original. But heading back into the main hub and past the missing auction house, that little path that led to the Valley of Honor and the Cleft of Shadow is now 3 levels. The Cleft of Shadow is now called the Voodoo Lounge, and it's also really glitchy, so excuse the jarring videography here. But the main difference that I can tell is that RFC isn't in yet, and the entrance is replaced by a tent. Heading to the Valley of Honor, you'll notice some differences in layout and texture. They have this big ramp here instead of that little pond where they had the fishing trainers. And the building that held the hunter trainers is different, and it now holds warrior trainers. and the hunter trainers are now where the warriors and battle masters were. And there's also this Colosseum where lore-wise Vari and Rin battled, but this would have been a cool dueling arena for players. Thrall's building is quite different, now holding 3 different rooms and being kind of confusing to navigate. If you remember in Desolus, that Burning Blade fortress where you escort out the Night Elf, it's basically 2 of those buildings squashed together, and Thrall is also hot pink. But back in Stormwind, since I mentioned it, something I missed from a previous episode are some NPC model changes, such as in the Chi shop, you have a more lightweight human. This is probably because it came from Star Wars Galaxies, which had character customization way ahead of its time. But I always thought it was kind of lame that you couldn't change your body type in the original character creation. And you still can't even to this day from what I know, aside from fat humans being a new race entirely, for whatever reason. But I always thought it would have been cool if you could have chosen between thin, fat, and mid forms to better match your class. It's like, this guy's pretty buff for a class with 5 strength. I don't know, maybe it's just me. Maybe it would have made it unfair because other races didn't have it. But I thought it would have been cool to be like this more stealthy, agile-looking rogue. Anyways, in a previous episode, we mentioned the survivalist profession, where there would be areas in the game that were very dark that you could navigate more easily by lighting torches. Something I found in this alpha is that we do actually have one such area. The Uldaman dungeon is actually incredibly dark. Honestly, it's probably just a glitch with the lighting, but out of all the times I've seen this profession discussed, I've never actually seen a dark area in the game, so I thought it would be cool to see what it could have looked like and how difficult it would have been to navigate these dungeons without a clearly lit path. In an earlier episode, we mentioned a spot in Ashara for an abandoned MOBA battleground called the Ashara Crater, but as it turns out, it wasn't the only one planned. So if you didn't know, shortly after Warcraft 3 launched, someone made a mod for it called Dota, which is short for Defense of the Ancients. This would birth what would eventually become a multi-billion-dollar genre of game called the MOBA, which is now dominated pretty securely by Riot's League of Legends and Valve's Dota 2. But as it turned out, World of Warcraft would try their hand with Vanilla's missing 4th battleground with Kaladar. So first off, here's just an overhead map of what they had until it was eventually scrapped. And anybody who's played MOBAs before will recognize the general layout. You have 3 main lanes with the Horde base in the northeast and Alliance in the southwest. So starting from the Horde side and taking a side lane, you'll notice a bunch of huts which would presumably spawn creatures. Obviously the idea is that each of these lanes would have towers and creeps that spawn, which will try to push into enemy territory, and you have to push with them, take out towers, and kill other players trying to do the same thing. Aside from that, you also have these side areas where neutral mobs spawn that you can kill for extra income and bonuses. And usually there's also a raid boss that spawns every now and then that requires multiple people, but if you can kill it or steal the kill from the other team, you get a big advantage. So here we have the Alliance's base. These main bases would serve as a form of defense and respite where you would spend currency to buy items or buffs, most likely. And going across the opposite side, it's the same thing. It's pretty much just mirrored from the other lane. You got some huts and caves where you would farm NPCs, and this would eventually lead back to the enemy's base. But going in the middle, we see a giant tower, which you could probably capture, and off to the side, another cave system, and on the opposite side, a goblin alchemy lab, so maybe more enemies to kill, or possibly even NPCs to recruit. Who knows? No one really knows why this was cut, but I do have a theory personally, and that's because we already got a MOBA battleground. It's Alterac Valley. Just think about it. You can summon NPCs, these Ram Riders, Griffin Riders, Knights, and raid bosses to push forward along the way, capturing towers which have ranged defenders, and you can kill optional neutral mobs for bonuses. In the middle spawns a giant raid boss that both factions can kill, and one side wins when they push the enemy back to their home base. Alterac Valley is this pseudo MOBA battleground adapted for an MMO setting, so my guess is that the reason why they scrapped this is maybe it was too redundant. I'm not sure. It's interesting though, and I think if they ever go down the Classic Plus route, this is just begging to be finished. I think that it would be a really interesting game mode that could have a lot of potential in the MMO setting. In previous episodes, we gave the major cities some love. We checked out Alpha Ironforge, Stormwind, and Orgrimmar. So this time we're going to take a look at the Undercity, which has two main big changes. The first is there's this second level to the Outer Ring. Each quarter has these set of stairs leading to these balconies where you can find some trainers and vendors. And my guess as to why this was changed was that, much like Alpha Ironforge, it was just too confusing and people were getting lost maybe. That seems to be a theme with the major cities in the Alpha. And the other difference is that the Inner Ring, which, as you may know, holds the auction house, is now a river of slime with bridges leading to the Outer Ring, making it much more harder to navigate, so just a convenience change here if I had to guess. Next up, we have the original Gadget Zan, which looks very different. It's missing that wall that surrounds the city, at the moment doesn't have any guards, and in general it looks much more sparse. A lot of the buildings are changed, and they're more resembling the buildings from Booty Bay, and there's just a few NPCs loitering about, so it's clearly still a work in progress. Since we're here though, I may as well give you the full Tannerus tour. Steamqueedle Port also looks much different. It's much bigger with more buildings strewn about, and the docks are also bigger, and there's a ship moored there. There's no boatmaster to be found, but if you remember from a previous episode, there was this mysterious boat in Theramore, so maybe it would have connected the two zones. Geographically, it makes sense since you could just go along the eastern coast here. You probably could do it even without a loading screen, sort of like that boat in Fairless for the Alliance. That would have been amazing, honestly, because it's always annoying getting to Tannerus for the first time as Alliance. You may be asking yourself, well, that's all well and good, but what about the Horde? To which I reply, fuck the Horde. Next up, we also have some NPC changes. The Wastewander Rogues have that sleek Defias Rogue model that most people first encountered in the Dead Mines with Roxor's guards. And as for the Warlocks, they also look very different. I don't even think that this model ever made it to the game. I definitely don't recognize it, at least. Quergo's Gold is also moved. It's now much further up north on the eastern coast where that little pirate town was, where you get the pirate hats and you kill Andre Firebeard. That's missing completely, so when they added it in, they moved Quergo's Gold to the southern coast. The Caverns of Time also look a little bit different. The door is definitely changed, and if you're wondering, unfortunately there is no actual cavern at this point. It just leads into the mountain. As for Zul'Farrak, it does exist, but it is uninstanced, and the trolls have a different model. The whole area is populated aside from the bosses, and I'm not sure if this is because it was a work in progress, but it could very well have been intended to be a high-level elite area instead of an instance, sort of like Jinta Alor in the Hinterlands, for instance. Remember, this was early 2000s. Instanced areas that people had for themselves was still a new thing, and these shared open areas filled with high-level enemies was the standard for what a dungeon was. If you remember from a previous episode, they were planning the same for Skolemans, but much like ZF, they ended up converting it into a dungeon. It does kind of make you wonder, though, how many more dungeons there could have been. Jinta Alor could have definitely been one, or possibly the Tainted Scar in Winter Spring, I can definitely see. So maybe another candidate for Classic Plus content if they ever go down that route. Although at the same time, I do think that there's value in open areas as well. I did also take a peek at those unmapped islands to the east that were used for the Scepter of the Shifting Sands questline. They do exist in this version, but they are a bit different, holding some gnomish and goblin buildings with a bunch of gadgets lying about. If you've seen previous episodes, you'll know that I also like to mix in some system stuff here and there. So first, starting with resistances. If you didn't know, Holy was originally a resistance, and it was buffable by priests. This would eventually be replaced with Arcane for some reason, which meant that aside from potions, there's no way to mitigate Holy damage in the game. And a question you might ask yourself then is, does that mean the gnome racial is also Holy? And the answer to that is no, because at this point, a lot of the racials weren't even added yet, so the only reason to pick gnome right now is because of their dashing good looks. As for the next class on our list, we have the Rogue. I mentioned this in the Hunter video, but at this point, Rogues, along with Hunters, are able to equip bucklers, not shields. At this point, there are two shield types, bucklers and shields, where the latter is more bulky, they had more armor and block, and were reserved for strength classes, like the warrior and paladin, and the bucklers, on the other hand, weren't as good. They're a little more lightweight, giving less protection. You may have heard before that rogues were at one point able to feign death. This was done with their feign death skill here, which required a reagent called a death capsule, which you crafted like a poison. Cheap shot at this point is cheap as hell, true to its name, as it is a 5-second stun, as well as adding some damage to an attack. And you'll also notice at this point that a lot of these abilities are daggers and swords only. Rogues can equip maces at this point in the game, but they just can't hardly use any abilities with them. Evasion functions similarly, except it also pacifies you now. I guess rogues are bad multitaskers. And as for the graphic, it leaves a lot to be desired. Feint was dangerous, as it required the target to be facing you. Alright, let me just reduce my threat here real quick. Oh, I cleared my threat. You may be thinking, that's weird. An ability that requires the target to be facing you. It must be one of those weird alpha things they got rid of. To which I say, you failed rogue school because you forgot about Gouge, which is also completely overpowered because it has no cooldown. And at this point, I'll remind you that there are also no diminishing returns. What were they thinking? Sprint is the same, aside from the animation just being a sped up walk cycle. This was the case in 1.0 though. I remember when they updated it to give an actual run animation, and it was pretty exciting. Yeah, my life was pretty boring. Sinister Strike is functionally the same, except it has this cool graphic. Why did they remove this? It's cool. Kidney Shot lasted 2 seconds for every combo point, which may seem broken, but wait until you see Garrote, which at this point was usable out of stealth. It was a combo point spender. It dealt damage over time and stunned the target for 10 fucking seconds per combo point. Imagine being hit by a 50-second stun while your health is getting drained. That's when you go get your beer. Well, that's pretty broken. But wait, how about a no cooldown stunning combo point generator? You know, to build up to the 50-second stun. They also had Trip, which deals some damage and knocks the target down, stunning them for a second with no cooldown. Holy shit. Aside from that, everything is the same. I'm not sure how much PvP was going on at this point in the game, but I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that rogues made people uninstall. Speaking of OP crap, this is kinda random, but you know how in the game you can loot these low-level items that turn out to be incredibly powerful? Like the best crowd control in the game, Magic Dust, which you get from level 15 elementals in Westfall. What's up with that? It's just one of those weird vanilla things. But if you thought that was broken, in the same zone from the Defias Trappers, at this point you could get what was called a hooked net, which immobilized any target from range for 10 seconds. Sort of like a farmable, really sticky glue. It was removed from the game because it was incredibly broken, obviously, but I guess the Magic Dust flew under the radar. I've kind of been in the mood lately, and I wanted to start this one out with a bang, and that's Ebonlock Xena Warrior Princess Transmog, as well as this magical cube with the face. Aw, he has a little friend, that's so cute. Nah, I'm just kidding, it's Alpha Karazhan. Before we leave Darkshire though, there's also this town crier, which I assume is here to warn people of Stitch's arrival. That's cool. I wonder why they took him out. Maybe he cried too much. But before we talk about Alpha Karazhan, I noticed that Deadwind Pass is also much different. It's missing that entire eastern road. There's just this single western path left, and leading up to the raid, it's much more open, and the building itself is absolutely huge. You can actually enter it from multiple different doors, and it's insanely big and very easy to get lost since it's obviously a work in progress and they haven't done the textures yet, so it sort of has this Superman's Fortress of Solitude thing going on. And I'll be honest, I wandered around here for over an hour trying to fully map it out, and just when I thought I had it figured out, I stumble across a new fork and get completely lost. I actually started to feel claustrophobic, which kudos to the devs if that's what they were going for. It's pretty impressive. So, while I regret to inform you that you won't see every inch, I'll show you most of it and stick to the most interesting stuff while I talk over it here. This is what you call a dungeon, or a raid, I guess. If you didn't know, Karazhan was intended to be in vanilla, and this was one of the early versions. If you read the Warcraft diary by former developer John Statz, he goes into detail as why it was pushed back into the Burning Crusade. It was largely due to time, but they also had a bunch of design hurdles. The history is that this isn't even the first version. Rather, that was built in 2001, and it was made before they had a real 3D modeling software. Instead, he just used the Quake editor because he had experience modding that game, and he made it completely alone. It took him about 6 months, and it was so big that it took 30 minutes to load it in the software. This was all scrapped eventually, and another designer was tasked with making it with the instructions to make it tall and slender. Well, the problem with that is, as you probably guessed by now, was that there's just very little playable room, and the whole dungeon is just a collection of stairs with an odd room here and there. So that's this version, and as you know, it was scrapped obviously, and they returned the project to John Statz for a third version, where the concept was that it would be a series of disconnected towers floating around a central spire, and this was scrapped because the pathing data at the time couldn't support moving structures. Remember, this was before boats and zeppelins were added, so the designers returned with another demand, to make it as big as the upper and lower Blackrock Spire combined. And it was from this that we saw the birth of the Karazhan crypts, which were approximately the size of Lower Blackrock Spire in terms of square footage, and the tower itself was to match upper. As history showed, the developers said it was way too big now, and due to all of these changes and redos, the crypt portion was scrapped and the whole thing was pushed back to the Burning Crusade, where it became the expansion's first 10-man raid. And also again, interesting to note that at this point it isn't an instance. Again, it could be because it's an obvious work in progress, but it could also mean that this was intended to be another outdoor raid area where you would race other people for boss spawns, which again was a common thing during this era of the MMO. All in all though, this was a lot of work for it to never see the light of day. It's definitely one of the most labyrinthine dungeons I've seen. I personally think it's more complicated than BRD, but that might just be because it's untextured, so it's really hard to navigate because everything looks the same. I don't know about you, but looking at this is starting to give me a headache, so let's move on. Before we do that though, do you have time to discuss the premier meal replacement brand, Control? Let's just be real here for a moment. Gamers and healthy diets are two things that aren't really known to have a lot of overlap, but that's where Control steps in. They've created healthier and more convenient food options designed specifically for people who live the gamer's life. First is their meal replacement shakes, which have just 1 gram of sugar and are packed with fiber and good carbs, keeping you full for hours, and they actually taste good. They've also got protein bars and cookies for a quick high-protein snack. It's Grand Marshal, World First 300 Fishing, and World First Bloodseal Admiral in the recreation of a 15-year-old video game approved. I've kind of been straying away from the gamer diet, and it's helped me get my nutrition back on track, and they're now giving me the chance to help you do the same by sponsoring this video. So if you're ready to start making healthier choices, head on over to this link and use my code for 10% off of your order. I recommend checking out their bundle builder, which is a good way to try different products at a discount to save some money. Or if you want to skip the shipping wait, you can also pick them up at your local GNC. Anyways, I feel like the sound design of WoW is one of the most unsung heroes of the game. Leveling up, logging in, bleed effects sounding like they're recorded in the bathroom. One of the most iconic sounds in the game that most would agree, I think, is the quest completion. Just listen to that. So triumphant. So beautiful. Just watch that XP roll in. Well, did you know that it was almost this? Ew. This does not spark joy. Herbalism is quite a useful gathering profession in the game, as it's critical in making a variety of useful raid consumables, and it's also unique in the sense that it has a rare node spawn called the Black Lotus, which is botted horrendously because Blizzard is a small indie game developer who's incapable of banning bots. Sorry about that. That just kind of happened spontaneously. But did you know that the same was planned with mining? The equivalent would have been the rare Arcanite lode, which looking through the game files would have dropped Arcanite ore, which you could presumably smelt into Arcanite bars. For unknown reasons, this would be scrapped, and as you probably know, the ability to make Arcanite bars was given to alchemists on a 2-day cooldown, and the removal left some design inconsistencies that now make sense. The other two gathering professions, herbalism and skinning, both have nodes or mobs that require the max level 300 to gather, with skinning even needing a knife and an enchant to get Onyxia's hide, which of course was required in order to clear the Blackwing lair. But meanwhile, the highest vein for mining, at least at launch, was the rich thorium vein, which was just 275, and then much later you had the obsidian shards that dropped off of the mobs in Ahn'Qiraj that required 305, but up until then, mining curiously had two ways to increase in skill that weren't really useful at all, and that was the Goblin Mining Helmet, only equipable by those who can wear at least mail, and also the Glove Enchant, but since rich thorium veins were yellow at 300, there really wasn't any use for these skill ups other than while a player was actively leveling their profession. So the idea here is that presumably these skill ups were intended for this removed Arcanite load, and with its removal, their usefulness was diminished. No one really knows why it was removed. My best guess was that they wanted to make alchemy more useful, so they switched the ability to make these bars to them, but as a consequence of this, with the timer, that meant that they were no longer farmable, and this would of course result in the Arcanite bar being one of the most expensive trade materials in the entire game. In a previous episode, we took a peek at Early Booty Bay, which had some changes. As it turns out, Zul'Gurub also has some stuff going on that I wanted to show off here. The entrance is much different first off, and it's currently blocked off by a wall, but going through it, you would find a dark portal, which if you remember was a placeholder signifying an instance was in the works. Of course, it's inactive at this moment, but going through it, we have this glitchy little path leading to the actual area, the size of which is quite large, about the size of the entire Deadwind Pass zone, as you could tell by looking at the map here. In the middle lies a large body of water with some underwater ruins near the entrance. And as for the tour, I'm going to first stick near the water since that has the most going on, and then we'll circle back along the edge of the mountains. And what you'll find is that it's very open. At this stage, they were just getting the geography how they wanted it, and there are some ruins placed here and there, but they were done very haphazardly, as you can tell. Eventually, we circled back to where we can see the entrance with these two long stretches of walls in the water, and going along the mountainside, it's much more untouched and open with little to no ruins at all. So this whole area would later be wiped from existence, and of course, as you know, ZG would eventually get its own dedicated instance where adventurers could take out Hakar and all of his priests. There are some other differences in the zone. The Curzon Cave at this point is much smaller. It's just a copy of one of the ones where it splits off into 3 paths, and it's also incredibly crowded. Hey Carl, how many mobs do you think we should put in this cave?
Oh, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, 1 million?
A lot of the mobs also share the Colonel's model, and if you're wondering where he was, he's not at the end like you would expect. Rather, he's just sort of hanging out in the front lines to the right near the entrance. I respect it. A leader who fights with the foot soldiers. I mean, I'd join his cult. Speaking of which, right outside, we have more model changes. It's the same as the Bloodsill Pirates in Tanarus from the last video. I'm not really sure how to describe them. They're like evil humans or cultist humans. I'm not sure. The rebel camp is the same. Again, just some different models here. And lastly, off to the west, we have some stuff going on. Interestingly enough, we have this swampy area with crocolisks that never made it into the live version of the game. And lastly, for Stranglethorn, we gotta talk about the Bengal Tiger Cave. This wasn't in the alpha at this point. Rather, this was a thing through all of the release up until the Cataclysm expansion, in fact. There was rumored to be this hidden tiger mount in the game called the Bengal Tiger because you could find it in the game files. Players scoured the world in search of the mount, and eventually they were led to the Stranglethorn Vale because, as you would imagine, it held a bunch of Bengal tiger mobs. People tried farming them endlessly in hopes that it was this ultra-rare drop, and eventually through some tricky out-of-bounds jumping, a lone cave was found in these mountains near Zul'Gurub. It was never designed for players to be able to reach. I think it was more just scenery for when you're flying over the zone, but there's quite a lot of detail put into it. You have this nicely lit path with a bunch of torches and crates scattered about, and this cave which holds these tarps, which vaguely look like Bengal tiger hides. Thus, the Bengal Tiger Cave was born. It was rumored that under certain conditions, a vendor will spawn in the cave and sell you the fabled mount. It only spawns at certain times, maybe once a year, or maybe you need to have this cape equipped to see the NPC, or maybe you need to be a hunter and have the tiger tamed as a pet, or maybe it was a mount that was planned at some point but was just eventually scrapped. Unfortunately, the most boring scenario is usually the case, and the Bengal tiger never existed, and the closest that players got was the Zulian tiger from the ZG raid, but that didn't stop it from becoming one of the biggest myths within the game's lore. The class for this episode is the warrior, but for some non-warrior stuff to begin, I happened to be playing an undead male, and I noticed that their grunts were much more zombie-like when they got hit. But the first big change is that both defensive and berserker stances are just straight up trained, and they also functioned a little differently. There seemed to be no threat system, or at least it was very early, so defensive stance just makes it so you generate rage when being hit, and berserker stance grants rage when hitting an enemy, and battle stance does both, and all three stances also grant access to exclusive abilities just like live. And if you thought that rage generation was slow in 1.12, you haven't seen anything. Even on low-level mobs, you can seriously use one ability every 20 seconds maybe. It's kind of ridiculous. In the last episode, we saw that rogues were missing kick. That's because it was originally a warrior ability. This was an interrupt, usable only in battle stance, as opposed to pummel, which, as you know, was berserker stance. They also have inner rage. In the alpha, it was an active ability, granting 50 rage instantly on a 5-minute cooldown. Charge is in the game at this point, but it currently just teleports you to the enemy because they hadn't finished the pathing for it yet. In fact, I remember in the early stages of the game, even when they did the pathing, it was notoriously buggy, and it would consistently phase players through the ground, dropping them into the void. Strike is pretty much heroic strike, more damage on your next swing. Cleave has a slowing component to it, and since there's no attack power stat yet, battle and demoralizing shout straight up increase or decrease melee and range damage, and there's even a shout skill that would increase as you use these abilities. But other than that, and as usual a plethora of abilities yet to be implemented, they're pretty similar. But that's about it for this one, I guess. Thanks for watching my video. There's a lot more to come in this series, as usual, so if you are enjoying it, be sure to check back soon. And aside from that, remember to like the video if you liked it, because I will see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.